A lot of people might find my critique of Dan Savage to be a little bit harsh. After all, Dan Savage is only known tangentially as a sex advice columnist. He's only really popular from a few communities in that dimension. In the mainstream, most people know him as the founder of the It Gets Better project. This is a project that was started in the early 2010s and focused on getting gay celebrities and their allies to make encouraging videos directed at gay teenagers to try to dissuade them from committing suicide. Since the gay suicide rate generally was very high, this seemed to be quite a noble effort. And Dan Savage in particular gained a lot of credibility for pioneering this particular project. I have to admit, a lot of these videos are very sincere, and some of them are even quite touching, even from a traditionalist who does not believe in the lifestyle that they promote. It's hard not to admire people trying to dissuade teens from taking their own lives in self-harm, and in that dimension I wish them all the best. But at the time they came out, I felt like something was wrong, that this was not entirely honest, and I believe that this was confirmed, because inevitably, the kind of message you saw in the It Gets Better videos led inevitably to this.
It's okay to be gay.
Oh, hi, babe. Do you know what is so deliciously hot to me? Big bad penis needs to come in and pop your hymen. And breasts come in all different kinds of shapes and sizes and colors. Before you run out and start putting things in your butt, you gotta know the anatomy.
For those of you not familiar with most internet or YouTubers, the clips I just showed you came from Laci Green, a sex educator, and another channel trying to essentially copy her style of sexual education. In short, this is a new form of sexual education that's mainly meant to be shared over social media, and that targets a very, very young audience. You can see this in the very cutesy sort of Sesame Street style language that both of the presenters use. The fact that they always seem to be talking down to their audience like they're children. But despite the disconcerting nature of the presentation, this type of sexual education has become all the more popular in the modern age. And it's hard to even conceptualize what the audience is. The mere presentation indicates that it's for a very young audience, but the subjects they discuss include oral sex, multiple partner sex, homosexuality, transgenderism, things that are just not appropriate, or are classically not seen as appropriate for very young audiences, even potentially prepubescent audiences. So what the heck is going on here? It's tempting to say that this is just the sexualization of children in some sort of sinister and nefarious way, but I don't think that's actually what's going on. What's going on is sort of the extension of the idea of sexual liberation when taken to its logical conclusion. In fact, I think the entire culture reached a turning point with the advent of the gay rights movement, and in particular gay marriage, especially when that movement was portrayed as an analogy to the civil rights movement. The second that gay rights became analogous to the civil rights movement, it ceased being a reform and became a moral crusade. The It Gets Better project that Dan Savage premiered simply refocused that from adult sexual experience to the sexual experience in bullying faced by children. Therefore, by the necessary logic of the civil rights crusade that had become the gay rights movement, educators had to focus their efforts of sexual lifestyle in on children. The impetus was purely liberation, but the end result was a propaganda campaign that essentially presented sex to children and sexualized them in a way they had never been before. I think I should step in here now and really present what would obviously be the counterpoint that most sexual educators would bring if I brought this critique to their attention. They would say that they have to provide this education because children themselves are having these experiences. Children are driving this. Children are the ones creating the demand, and the sexual educators are just responding by matching a need. They're just the ones being there, making sure it's safe. They're responding to a reality that is really impersonal and just something that derives from human nature itself. Frankly, I find this incredibly difficult to believe, even from my own experience. I have seen from my generation and compared them to this current generation that I was much more sexual and naive than the children that are graduating from high school now are. We also know that children of a previous age had very, very little exposure to sex and were more or less naive well into their 20s. So it seems like a fundamental quality that can change depending on society's attitude, not something that's driven necessarily from children's own perceptions of reality. think we underestimate how plastic the sexual nature of children is. Now, I know in the contemporary world, oftentimes much too much is placed on neuroplasticity, and people act like there's no inherent human nature. But in this case, I think that we really should take a step back, because all evidence points to the fact that children really respond in kind to the kind of sexual culture they're placed within. In this dimension, children very often will do what adults present as being normal or preferable. Now, I'm far from an expert in this dimension, but I have long speculated that early sexual contact to children, despite it being incredibly harmful, probably is not something that children would in and of themselves resist. Unlike, say, a hot stove that a child will touch and then immediately draw away from because they can feel the pain, early sexual exposure is something much, much more like antifreeze, which tastes sweet as a child eats it, but destroys them from the inside. This would explain the type of grooming behavior oftentimes played up by pedophiles, who are able to convince a child to be a consensual partner in a sexual relationship that will later emotionally haunt them. But this further plays out because it indicates that we can push sexual education and sexualization of children back and back and back, earlier and earlier to younger and younger ages, and not really expect any resistance from children. Children will likely conform and repeat back the very lessons they're taught, and thus their cooperation with the curriculum will be represented as if it is the demand and the impetus for the education itself. The sexualization of children, while being done for sort of a civil rights and liberationist perspective, will nonetheless be something done to children, not done with any kind of legitimate consent by the children, even though it will look like that at the time. And now we get into some of the more sinister elements of this entire sexual revolution project. While it's generally wrong to associate sinister motives with your opponents, I can't help but thinking that people on the left and people who are the sexual educators must at some point realize the process they have started. They know that sexual education and sexualization will increasingly creep to younger and younger ages, and they know that there'll be very, very little resistance to this by children. They also probably know how utterly detrimental it will be to children when it is introduced from an educational perspective. While I genuinely wonder how these thinkers reconcile this core contradiction, I can't but hope they think that this is inevitable and they're simply trying to make the best of the situation. In particular, I think this takes two manifestations. There are those thinkers who actually think that the introduction of sexualization of children is going to be a benefit to both children and society in general. Already you can hear whispers about this in some of the more radical progressive elements of the web. Moreover, I think this whole sexualization of children has a reverse effect, or a corollary, where sexualization in general is treated as very much something that is part of childhood, and something that is itself infantilized. Therefore, as children become more sexualized, adult sexual behavior becomes more infantilized. We see things like affirmative consent laws. We see things that essentially imply that there can be no consequences of sex because the people who engage in it aren't actually agents that can take responsibility for the decisions they make. This, of course, is the natural process of a sex that is engaged in children, who can naturally not be responsible for the things that they consent to. This provides ample opportunity for the administrative state and for administrators at the managerial level to become involved in adult affairs to a level unimagined before in a society where sex was prohibited and strictly between adults who were taking responsibility for others in a family arrangement. And here the cruel logic of the core incoherency of the sexual revolution becomes fully apparent. It is an alliance between people of a perverted sexual nature and those who want an authoritarian control over adult behavior. The former see this as a portal to a new world where their behavior will in part be accepted under certain provisions, and the latter see it as a portal to a world where their services of control will be utterly necessary in order to stave off utter societal chaos. But the result will be a world where authoritarian control will have to be necessary in almost all areas of engagement, because to do otherwise will obviously work to the detriment of children and to the psychological destruction of the citizen as a whole. Frankly, I don't believe that any of this could even be incorporated into a society in the long term. As I stated in previous videos, this whole perspective of sexual liberation is totally incompatible with the larger project of having replacement-level birth rates. But at the same time, I think the people involved in this project are less interested in the survival of society in the century-level scale, and are more interested in controlling society, or even controlling a society that's rapidly crashing into the ground. They don't care that the plane's going down, they just care that they're going to be at the helm when it finally makes impact. And hence you see the central obsession with modern elites at promoting sexual identity as a legitimate identity above that of religion and nation. People who have sexual identity as their primary identity are fundamentally identified as consumers, as people that need to be taken care of, as people that need to be served, not as people who have responsibilities, as religion and the nation-state usually imply. By encouraging sexual identities over the more classical ones of nationhood and religion, we encourage people who are fundamentally consumeristic, and consumeristic people are easy to control. We end as a society of children who really only have identities as consumers and are totally dependent on the administrative state to take care of us and plan the future of our families and of future generations. The project of self-governance has been fundamentally defeated, but at a very, very subtle level, one that marched in the name of liberation at every step of the process.